History books celebrate European explorers who discovered new worlds, but they erased the man who made it possible. A black navigator whose genius turned impossible voyages into reality. His knowledge opened the gates to global exploration. Today, we uncover the truth they didn't want you to know. If you've ever wondered whose stories were deliberately left out of history books, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we're about to reveal one of history's greatest cover-ups. Share this with someone who loves real history. Now, let's begin. The year was 1497, and along the bustling docks of Lisbon, Portugal, ships creaked and swayed against their moorings. Sailors shouted orders, while cargo handlers loaded barrels of salted meat, casks of water, and coils of rope thick as a man's arm. The air smelled of salt, tar, and ambition. These weren't ordinary trading vessels preparing for a routine voyage. These ships were about to attempt something that had killed dozens of men before them. They were heading into waters that Europeans barely understood, chasing a route to India that many believed was impossible. The Portuguese crown had invested everything in this mission. Find a sea route around Africa to reach the riches of India, and Portugal would control the spice trade fail, and the ships would join the wreckage of previous expeditions rotting at the bottom of unknown seas. The stakes couldn't be higher, but the captains had a problem. They had maps, yes, crude drawings based on rumors and guesswork. They had instruments, compasses, and astrolabes built by the finest craftsmen. They had courage and desperation in equal measure. But none of that was enough. The seas beyond the southern tip of Africa were a mystery to them, and mysteries killed sailors. That's when they brought him aboard. A man whose presence on those ships would change world history forever, even though history would spend the next 5 centuries trying to forget he existed. He was an African navigator from the East African coast, a man who knew the Indian Ocean the way Europeans knew the Mediterranean. His skin was dark, his knowledge was vast, and his role in what came next was absolutely critical. The Portuguese records gave him different names in different documents, sometimes calling him a pilot, sometimes a guide, sometimes barely mentioning him at all. But the truth, buried in fragments of old letters and ship logs, tells a different story. Without him, the age of global exploration might never have happened, at least not the way it did. The navigator came from a world that Europeans were only beginning to encounter. The East African coast in the 15th century wasn't some backwater waiting to be discovered. It was a sophisticated network of trading cities, places where ships from Arabia, Persia, India, and China had been arriving for centuries. Swahili merchants grew wealthy trading gold, ivory, and slaves. Arab dhows sailed with the monsoon winds, following patterns refined over generations. Knowledge flowed as freely as goods. How to read the stars in the southern hemisphere, when the winds would shift, where the dangerous reefs lurked beneath turquoise waters, which currents could carry a ship swiftly east, and which ones would smash it against rocks. This was the navigator's world. He'd learned from masters who'd learned from their masters, an unbroken chain of maritime wisdom stretching back centuries. He could look at the night sky and know exactly where he was, using stars that European astronomers had never charted. He understood the monsoon cycle, how winds blew northeast for half the year and southwest for the other half, a natural engine that powered trade across the entire Indian Ocean. He knew that leaving at the wrong time meant months of being becalmed, and leaving at the right time meant swift sailing and fortune. This knowledge wasn't written in books. It lived in the minds and hands of men who'd spent their lives at sea. How exactly he ended up on those Portuguese ships remains murky. Some accounts suggest the Portuguese encountered him when they reached the East African coast, recognized his expertise, and hired him. Other evidence hints at something less voluntary, a common practice in that era when hiring and capturing often meant the same thing for Europeans dealing with people they considered inferior. What's certain is this: when those ships left East Africa to cross the Indian Ocean, heading for India, a black African navigator stood among the crew, and the European captain, for all his pride and titles, knew enough to listen. The early days of the voyage tested everyone. European sailors looked at this African man with suspicion. Why should they trust him? Their world was built on the assumption of European superiority, the idea that white Christians were naturally more intelligent, more capable, more deserving of authority. Yet here was their captain, deferring to this navigator's judgment about which direction to sail. It went against everything they'd been taught to believe. But the sea doesn't care about prejudice. The sea only cares about knowledge. The navigator proved himself quickly. When clouds obscured the sun and European instruments became useless, he read the water itself. The color told him depth. The movement told him currents. The temperature told him proximity to land. When the wind shifted unexpectedly, he ordered sail adjustments that kept them on course while European navigators were still consulting their charts. When a storm approached, he recognized the signs hours before anyone else saw them and guided the ships to shelter. Each correct decision built credibility. Each disaster avoided made the skeptics quieter. Survival is a powerful teacher, and the crew was learning that this man's knowledge was keeping them alive. The crossing to India required navigation skills that Europeans simply didn't possess. The Indian Ocean wasn't like the Atlantic waters the Portuguese knew. Different stars dominated the sky. Different winds governed movement. The navigator used methods that seemed like magic to the crew. He dropped weighted lines to test depth and feel the ocean floor's composition. He watched birds and knew from their species and flight patterns how far land was and in which direction. He tasted the water and could tell when they were near river mouths that fed into the sea. This was science, refined over centuries by people whose lives depended on getting it right. There were moments of crisis where his expertise became undeniable. When the ships encountered currents that pushed them off course, the navigator knew how to use countercurrents to compensate. When they needed fresh water and the European charts showed no islands, he guided them to places he knew existed, safe harbors where previous voyages had stopped. When disease began spreading through the crew and they desperately needed to make landfall, he calculated precisely how many days to the nearest port, information that let the captain ration supplies accordingly. And then they reached India. The ships sailed into port on the Indian coast, and the impossible had become real. Europeans had successfully navigated around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. The trade route that would reshape global commerce was now open. The spices, silk, and wealth of the East were suddenly accessible by sea. The world would never be the same. As the crew celebrated, as the captain prepared his reports for the Portuguese king, the navigator stood among them. His knowledge had made this possible. The route they'd followed was one he knew. The dangers they'd avoided were ones he'd identified. The success they celebrated was built on his expertise. Initially, there was acknowledgement. Letters sent back to Portugal mentioned the navigator's crucial role. Ship logs documented his decisions. The captain himself knew that without this man's guidance, they would have failed like the expeditions before them. But then something began to happen. something insidious and deliberate. As the story of the voyage spread across Europe, as it became a tale of European triumph and discovery, the navigator's role started to shrink. First, he became a minor character, then a footnote. Then, in many accounts, he disappeared entirely. The return journey was even more treacherous than the voyage out. Supplies were lower. The crew was exhausted, and the ships were loaded with goods that made them slower and harder to handle. The navigator guided them back, using different routes than they'd taken on the outward journey, taking advantage of seasonal changes in wind and current. Not all the crew survived. Disease and accidents claimed lives, but the ships made it back to Portugal, and when they arrived, they carried proof that European ships could now trade directly with Asia. The economic and political implications were staggering. What happened to the navigator after this historic voyage? The records become frustratingly vague. Some documents suggest he made additional voyages. Others imply he stayed in Portugal for a time, but gradually, deliberately, he was written out of the story. Why? Because the age of exploration was being crafted into a narrative of European genius and superiority. Admitting that a black African's knowledge had been essential to the greatest voyage of the era didn't fit that narrative. It complicated the story that Europeans were telling themselves about their right to dominate the world. The erasure wasn't accidental. It was systematic. As histories were written and rewritten, the navigator's contributions were minimized or attributed to others. The European captain received all the credit. The skills and knowledge that came from centuries of African and Arab maritime tradition were ignored. It became a story about European courage and innovation, with no room for the truth that Europeans had needed non-European expertise to succeed. This pattern repeated across the age of exploration. Indigenous guides, non-European navigators, local knowledge, all of it was erased or diminished to maintain the fiction of European exceptionalism. But the evidence survived, scattered and fragmented, waiting for historians willing to look beyond the official narratives. Ship logs that mentioned the navigator, letters that referenced his skills. Portuguese records that, when examined carefully, revealed the truth. Modern scholars have pieced together what happened, recovering a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about the age of exploration. And it's not just one story. The more historians dig, the more they find similar accounts. Other African navigators, Arab pilots, indigenous guides, all playing crucial roles in European voyages, all systematically erased from history. The navigator's impact on world history cannot be overstated. The route he helped establish became the primary trade connection between Europe and Asia for centuries. The knowledge he shared influenced Portuguese maritime practices for generations. The success of that voyage triggered a cascade of exploration, colonization, and global trade that shaped the modern world. Every time a European ship successfully crossed the Indian Ocean in the following decades, it followed principles and routes that the navigator had helped establish. His genius opened the world, even as the world forgot his name. Think about what this means. The spice trade, the colonization of Asia, the global economy that emerged in the following centuries, all of it traces back to voyages that required expertise Europeans didn't have. The story we've been told about European explorers bravely venturing into the unknown and discovering new worlds through their superior knowledge is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. The truth is more complex and, honestly, more interesting. It's a story of knowledge exchange, of Europeans learning from people they would later claim to be inferior, of achievements built on collaboration even when that collaboration was forced or unacknowledged. Why does this matter today? Because the lies we tell about history shape how we see the present. When we erase the contributions of African, Arab, and indigenous people to human achievement, we make it easier to believe in hierarchies that place some groups above others. When we pretend that all significant innovation and discovery came from Europe, we distort our understanding of human capability and potential. When we uncover these hidden stories, we don't just correct the historical record, we challenge the assumptions that still govern how we think about race, intelligence, and worth. The Navigator's story is one of thousands that have been buried. How many other geniuses had their contributions stolen or erased? How many innovations were attributed to the wrong people? How much knowledge was dismissed because it came from the wrong kind of person? These aren't just academic questions. They're about recognizing that brilliance exists in all human communities, that knowledge comes from many sources, and that the stories we've been told about who matters and who doesn't are often serving someone's agenda. Imagine if history had been honest. Imagine if the Navigator had been celebrated as he deserved. If children learned his name alongside the European captains, if his expertise was acknowledged as the foundation of European success in the Indian Ocean, how might that have changed the narratives that justified centuries of colonialism and slavery? How might it have changed our world today? We can't rewrite what happened, but we can reclaim what was hidden. We can tell the truth about who contributed to human progress. We can honor the genius that was deliberately forgotten. The Navigator opened the gates to the age of global exploration. His knowledge of stars, winds, and currents turned an impossible dream into reality. His expertise saved lives and created the foundation for centuries of trade and exchange. He was brilliant, essential, and deliberately erased. But erasure is never complete. The truth has a way of surviving, waiting in fragments of old documents, in patterns of successful voyages, in questions that careful historians dare to ask. The Navigator's legacy lies in every ship that crossed the Indian Ocean after him, in every trade route that connected continents, in the global world we inhabit today. His story reminds us to question who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. It teaches us to look for the hidden hands that shaped history. It challenges us to recognize genius wherever it comes from, even when acknowledging it complicates the simple stories we prefer to tell. The Navigator guided those ships across unknown waters. Now his story guides us toward a more honest understanding of our shared past. And in that understanding, we find not division, but connection. Not hierarchy, but humanity. Not one people's triumph, but the complex, collaborative truth of how human beings have always learned from each other, built on each other's knowledge, and achieved great things together, even when history tried to hide it. The Navigator's story was buried for centuries, but now you know the truth. Don't let this knowledge stop with you. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes. Subscribe for more hidden history that changes everything you thought you knew. Drop a comment telling us what shocked you most. Share this video. Let's make sure the Navigator's genius is finally recognized. Which untold story should we uncover next? Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next one.